So we talked about mountain lion blood and we talked about turkey blood. So let's talk about human blood. When you guys first came into camp, I said this camp was about three things. What is the adventure camp about here at the Whittington Center? What was it about? What was the first one?
Leadership?
Leadership, yes. Two.
Patriotism.
Patriotism. And finally?
Marksmanship.
Marksmanship. Leadership, patriotism, and marksmanship. Those are all related to the founding of this country. They all three go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other in regards to the liberties that we enjoy today. Let's go back to that first day of the Revolutionary War when it all began. Does anybody know what that date is?
April 19, 1775.
Yes, good. April 19th, 1775. That was the very first day of the Revolutionary War. Is that the same as the American Revolution? Is there a difference between the Revolutionary War and the American Revolution? Think about that. Our second president, John Adams, talked about the difference between the Revolutionary War and the American Revolution. He made a very clear distinction. The Revolutionary War, according to Adams, was about people and places and battles and events. That was the Revolutionary War. The American Revolution was something completely different. And he explained that very succinctly in some of his writings. He said the American Revolution was a revolution of thought, a revolution in the minds and the hearts of the people on how they wanted to rule themselves. He said, John Adams said, the Revolutionary War was won before the first shots were fired on Lexington Green. In other words, we already won that war. We were already on the same page when the first shots broke out. Do you think Americans are on the same page today? No? No. How does that make you feel? We're not on the same page.
Upset. Upset.
Upset? You can yell it out.
Worried. Worried.
Worried. Kind of scared? If something like that happened, we'd still be arguing and fighting and bickering amongst ourselves, kind of like what we do today. It'd be very frightening. Let's go back to that day and start looking at some of the specifics of that day that helped to make us who we are today. There's a lot of characters that we're going to talk about. Some of them are very important people. Let's talk about a man named Paul Revere. Paul Revere was not just an express writer. He was a silversmith. He helped to coin currency. He was an engraver. And he was also a member of something called the Committee of Safety. The Committee of Safety was something that the colonists formed. It was basically a spy network. They had to spy on the British. The British spied on us. We spied on them. Everybody kind of knew what was going on. But our side really knew what was going on, thanks to Paul Revere and his Committee of Safety. There's some very important events to start with real quick. Y'all remember the Boston Tea Party in 1773. That's when King George decided he was going to impose taxes on us. King George lied to us. He said he would never tax us if we would help him fight in the French and Indian War up in Canada. Well, a few years later, England started going broke. What did the king do? He decided he would tax the colonists. The colonists were free market capitalists and they were very, very successful at what they were doing. What a better place to start taxing. It was only like a small tax, maybe 1 or 2 cents if you go back and compare it to today. But they were so upset, so angry, a bunch of them dressed up as Indians threw the tea in the harbor as a protest. Didn't do a whole lot of damage. They didn't hurt anybody. It was just a protest. But that really got the attention of King George. What he did after that, he closed the port of Boston. All the harbor was closed. Nothing could get in, nothing could get out. He was basically trying to starve us to death. What is another thing? If we tried to starve you to death and you wanted to submit somebody to tyranny, what's another thing that you have to do to them? What do you have to remove from society? What right would you might have to take it away?
Guns.
What's that?
Guns.
Guns. You'd have to disarm them first, right? So that's the next thing he tried to do. There's something called the powder alarms, which happened in 1774 in a small town in Boston, near Boston. And what happened was about 300 some British regulars marched into an arsenal where we had our powder storage. They took powder, they took ball, they took whatever kind of war materials they could find and stole it. That so upset the colonists and so much scared them that they decided, they had thought that maybe, perhaps, the Revolutionary War had started. And within 6 hours, an estimated 14,000 people had descended on that area where the British regulars were. Nobody fired a shot. It hadn't started yet, but the colonists, like us, were so concerned that something was happening. That pretty much scared them too. The powder alarms. It was after that Paul Revere started the Committee of Safety, a spy network. They weren't going to let that happen again. 14,000 people in 6 hours, no cell phone, no internet. This is how they did it. They were able to get together. Is there anybody sitting here that think you guys, anybody among you guys, could get 14,000 of your buddies in 6 hours with your rifle, with your bug-out bag, all ready to go to meet a threat? Foreign, domestic, terrorist, whatever. How about 1,000? Could you get 1,000 people? 1,000 of your buddies? 1,000. Could you get 100? 100 people, almost enough to fill up that cafeteria. Solid people, got their rifles, got their pack, ready to go out and drop the hammer on a threat. Anybody could do that? What about 10? Yeah, 10 buddies? Think you could do 10? Yeah, a lot of you saying yeah, 10 buddies. So let's look at that for a minute. 10 buddies versus 14,000. If the measure of the value of liberty is determined by your willingness to show up and defend it, who do you think values liberty more? The people of today or the colonists back then?
Colonists.
The colonists back then, in an era of information, firearms, and the colonists value it more than we do today. Let that sink in a little bit. Let that sink in. So April 19th, 1775, shortly after midnight, it was determined by Paul Revere and his Committee of Safety that the British were indeed going to march. They were going to march to Concord. And there's one thing they wanted at Concord above all other things. Does anybody know what that was? Weapons? Yeah, there's something more specific. Then yell it out if you can hear it.
Black powder?
Black powder? Yeah, they wanted that too. Something else.
Cannons.
Cannon. They wanted cannon. The colonists had stolen cannon out of Boston, part of the militia. They snuck in there at night, got a bunch of cannon, the carriages, and snuck them out of town. And they had they estimated about 6 cannon that they stole and they took to Concord. Imagine having a cannon in your backyard. If you had one cannon in every 6 or 8 blocks, imagine how safe your community would be, because that's a game changer. You know, even like these 155 howitzers they use to shoot down avalanches, you can tow those behind a big truck and, you know, 24 rounds, that's pretty much going to be a game changer, anybody trying to mess with you. So they wanted to get that cannon. General Gage ordered Colonel Smith and Major John Picton to take some regulars and march to Concord and take war materials. But he warned them very carefully. He says, do not burn the town down, do not loot anything, and do not kill anyone. He just wanted them to go there, take the stuff, and come back. War materials. That's all he wanted. He didn't want to harm anyone. He wanted to do this peaceful as he could. As it turned out, that was not the case. So Paul Revere rode out on that fateful night, shortly after midnight. What did he say? What did he say? What was he yelling as he went?
The British are coming?
The British are coming? No, he didn't say that. He actually did not say that. Believe it or not, and I know everybody thinks that's what he said, but what did he really say? He said, turn out, the regulars are out, meaning the British regulars, the regular army. At that point, everybody was a British American. So that would be today like yelling, the Americans are coming. Well, which Americans? The government, the military, the police Americans? So he said the British regulars is what he meant. The regular army was coming, and they were marching that night. As Paul Revere raced through those streets along what we call Battle Road today, he wasn't just yelling that out randomly. He was going to specific militia leaders where he knew they would be able to alert their own militias, their neighbors, their friends, people who were armed and ready to go. Some of those 14,000 people that turned out to defend liberty, they were all prepared. They'd been preparing this for 6 or 8 years at least. They were versed in marksmanship. They didn't have a constitution, they didn't have a Second Amendment, but they had the will to defend their liberties with the only thing they had, their musket. As Paul Revere got through, he went past Lexington. He wore John Adams and Sam Hancock, two very important, Sam Adams and John Hancock. He warned them because they were rabble rousers. They were able to ignite the brush fires in men's mind and get the entire colonies all worked up. You've heard a good emotional speaker, someone who can really get you wired up. That's what these two guys were good at. And they caused a lot of people to get ready to go for what was going to be the Revolutionary War. As Revere was going past Lexington, he started to get to Concord, and he was stopped by a British patrol. A British patrol had blocked the road. He had two other riders with him, a man named William Dawes and a man named Sam Prescott. Sam Prescott was from Concord. Dawes was from Boston. Revere was from Boston. They were stopped right there. The British officer named Major Mitchell went up to him, jerked him off his horse, put a gun to his head and said, "Ah, the mighty Paul Revere, what would you be doing out on a night like this?" Paul Revere had to think really fast on his feet, because what do you say to somebody when, what are you doing out this time of night? You know, you gotta be kind of truthful, or you don't want to be truthful. You have to make a choice. Paul Revere just said, "The war is on, the revolution is here, you're all dead men." And just as he said that, off in the distance were a bunch of muskets that went off. Probably about a dozen, or maybe two of them, muskets going off. And those British regulars stood there. They heard Paul Revere. They heard those muskets going off, and they thought, the guy must be telling the truth. So they let him go. They stole his horse, let him go. William Dawes was able to escape and hide off in the woods. Sam Prescott made it to Concord, where he was able to warn some of the colonists, some of the militiamen. We'll get to that in just a second. Let's go back to Lexington Green, where the shots had happened. Let's go back there in time. What was happening is early in the morning, the militia had all gathered under a man named Captain John Parker. They were all waiting. They'd already heard the British were marking it. It was kind of like, 3 or 4 in the morning, and nothing had happened. So they decided, there's nobody around here, let's go get a bite to eat and a drink inside the tavern. So the only really way to safely unload a muzzleloader is to fire it. So all these people were firing it all at once. At the same time, Revere said the revolutionary began. Some people say that that's divine intervention, that was one of the things that worked so good for the colonists that day. So keep that in mind, that there's maybe a higher power operating that helps run this country. It certainly seems to be the case back then. A few hours later, the men decided to disperse, and some of them went home. But when Parker heard of another express rider coming up and told him that the regulars are just down the road, he said they're literally a half a mile down the road. So that as many men as Captain John Parker could assemble on the green with the militia, they all stood out there. There was about 77 of them. And they weren't just a regular army, they were part of the militia. They were fathers and sons, cousins, uncles, brothers. They were all related to each other. They were part of a family that had been founded over 150 years ago. They had generations of people, and they all knew each other. They trained together. And they were standing in a line, waiting as the sun came up. As the sun was coming up, Parker was standing there. His men were in a line. The British officers came up. They hadn't been told what was going to happen. And they saw Parker and his men stop. And they thought, oh, that must be the reason we're marching here, is those men. They mean war with us. So they kind of surrounded them. The British regulars surrounded our men in a half circle. And we stood there and we wondered what was going to happen. Imagine being outnumbered with about 77 of us and close to 300 British regulars. How would that make you feel? Probably a little bit overwhelmed. John Parker was looking. Nobody was going to do anything. They didn't want to start a war. And suddenly, a young militia member who was probably about 16 years old with a musket taller than him looked up to Captain John Parker and he said, "Sir, would it not be wise to retreat?" And Captain Parker looked down at him and he said, "Retreat? The first man to retreat, I'll shoot myself." And they stood their ground. Parker said, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but they mean to have a war, let it begin here." They stood there, waiting. Nobody had fired yet. Finally, Parker realized, yeah, we're outnumbered, we've stood our ground, we've shown them we're not going to give up our firearms. One of the officers came up, Major John Pickering. He pulled a sword out, came right up to the militia, and he said, "Disperse you rebels and lay down your arms." Nobody laid down their arms. Never give up your arms. Ever. Never give up your firearms. Parker stood there. He didn't realize after a while that probably we made our point. He told his men to retreat. They started to retreat. They went, their families were all watching. They were wondering what was happening. As they turned to walk away and their backs were facing the British regulars, a shot rang out. A shot, that first shot of the Revolutionary War rang out. Reverend Jonas Clark said that first shot was fired by a British officer in the middle of all the formation. He said it was a man on a horseback, probably an officer, with a pistol in his hand, yelling out obscenities out towards the colonists. He said that's who fired that first shot. Anyway, when that first shot happened, the British regulars in the front row thought that that was a signal to fire. So they all started firing. They fired right into the backs of John Parker's retreating men. The British regulars fired the first volley into the backs of our men and boys as we were retreating back to our families. 5 sets of fathers and sons were separated by death that day on Lexington Green when we were shot in the back, right in front of their wives, their sisters, their aunts, their cousins. They all witnessed it. One man named Jonathan Harrington was shot right in the gut. He was able to crawl up to the doorstep where he died in front of his wife and his kids. The Harrington house is still there today. There's a testimony to a man that died for our liberties. At this point, the British were out of control. They were starting to loot. They were starting to burn things down. They had already killed people. They had already violated what General Gage had ordered them not to do, and that was to not loot, not burn down, and not kill anybody. They'd already blown it. When Major Colonel Smith came up, he saw what was happening. He called for a drummer, fifer, got his men in order, and off to Concord they started about 6:30 or 7 in the morning. Off they went to march. Some of the other officers said, "Sir, this is a bad idea." The British colonel just looked down and he said, "I have my orders and we are marching." And off to Concord they went. So let's go back in time again to where Sam Prescott had reached the militia, where he went to one man. He knew he was going to go to one man. He got through that roadblock and he was going to go to one man. And that one man is so famous today, there's a whole statue built for him, dedicated to him at the North Bridge of Concord in Boston along Battle Road. That man is so famous that Project Appleseed uses a likeness of him on their logo. That man's name is Isaac Davis. Isaac Davis was a very special man. He was a captain of a militia of men who were called Minutemen, ready to be ready in a minute. We talked about those 14,000 guys that showed up. These guys were ready in a minute. They were ready to, as soon as they heard alarm, they were ready to come out. They were Minutemen. Isaac Davis was a gunsmith. He had his men all the finest rifles, muskets of the day, and they all had bayonets and cartridge boxes to efficiently hold all their powder and ball. They were ready to go. Imagine what that might be like if you were standing around, something bad was happening. Isaac Davis was a family man. He had a wife and some sick kids. His kids were crying. His wife was worried. She knew something very, very bad was about to happen. She had a bad gut feeling because an owl had flown in the door a few days later, landed on their mantle and sat there, and that was considered bad luck. She thought, something's bad's about to happen. She wrote in her diary many years later, Hannah Davis, Isaac Davis's wife, she said of that night, she said it was cold. There were men, all manner of men with all kinds of weapons, men I hadn't seen before. There was much fear and much confusion. She said she recognized a lot of the men that were around there. They were part of the regular militia and Minutemen that they trained with. But there was one thing she said. She said, I had a bad feeling tonight. She said, when my husband Isaac left to go out, I was waiting for something profound for him to say to me. What would you say to your wife and your kids as you walked away from them under a situation like that? Hannah Davis wrote in her diary, she said, my husband looked at me and he said, take care of the children. And he walked out into the darkness, into the unknown with his men. They marched up to a little place near Punkatasset Hill. They could look down towards the North Bridge, couldn't quite see it. They could look kind of down towards Concord, and they could kind of see where the town was, but they couldn't really see anything. Down in Concord was where all the older men and women were, where the women and the children were hanging out there. The British had closed off the North Bridge, they closed off the South Bridge. Nobody was coming in, nobody was going out of Concord. Everybody was kind of trapped. They also had those cannon were hidden. They were hidden very well. When Major John Pickering came in, he had a hunch where those cannon were. He went to a tavern and got to the tavern keeper. He pulled him down, threw him on the floor, put a gun to his head. He says, where are those cannon at? And the tavern keeper was so scared he just kind of pointed out around the corner. What they did is most of the cannon they weren't going to get those cannon out of there because they disassembled them and made them so they'd be very hard to tow away, but they did know the cannon were there. Major Pickering was very, very upset. He wasn't going to be able to get those cannon. So they were going to go door to door and start searching for any kind of war materials, any powder, any ball. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to disarm us. That's how they did it back then. That's how they'll do it today, is to disarm us. They'll start with powder. They'll start with ball. They'll start with firearms. They'll start with laws. Nothing's changed in history. Do you think we've learned anything from our history? No. Do you think we have a hope? Is there hope for this nation?
Yes.
You guys are our hope. You guys are our hope. Trust me, you guys are the hope. That's why we're all here on this center, is for you guys. As Captain Isaac Davis and his militia were up near Punkatasset Hill looking down, all of a sudden they saw smoke rising out of the town, billowing up, huge flame of smoke. What was happening was they were looting the homes, they were putting stuff out in the middle of the Lexington Square, they pulled down the Liberty Pole, they took the Meeting House Bible, they were burning anything they could. That fire got so big, so huge, it almost burnt down their meeting house. And when it looked like it was about ready to burn down a meeting house, a little old woman walks out. The town matriarch, about 80-some years old, a woman named Martha Moulton. She looked over at those young British soldiers and said, put that fire out. And they snapped to attention and started putting that fire out. They obeyed this little old lady who looked like she meant business, and they started a bucket brigade. What they didn't know was up inside that meeting house was about 30 or 40 half barrels of powder. You can imagine what that would be like. It would be like a huge bomb that would go off. But she probably saved the town, saved their powder. One person made a difference. One person stood up to do something correct. So meanwhile, up on the hill still, they're looking down there. They're watching the smoke billow up. And finally, a man named Lieutenant Hosmer looked over at Colonel Barrett, who was the leader of the militia in that area. And he says, are we just going to stand here while they burn down our town? And before he could say anything next, Captain Isaac Davis stepped up. He pulled his sword out, and he said some of the most famous words in American history, words you probably never heard before, words that represent the epitome of courage and determination in the face of the unknown. He said, I have not a man who is afraid to go, and off they marched down to that north bridge. When they got about inside of that north bridge, 40 or 50 yards, they were looking down there. They saw there were redcoats packed like sardines on that bridge. They were not going to get back to that bridge. They could not get back to their families. They didn't know what to do. The colonies all lived by the rule, by don't fire unless fired upon. If you guys start the war, we're not going to help you. That's what the rest of the colony said. Nobody was going to fire. So they got down there, the militia, we were looking at the redcoats were looking at us. Another standstill. Again, what are we going to do? Is this a war or not? Nobody really knew. All of a sudden, once again, without orders, a British officer came racing up on a horse. He fired a pistol right down in the river by that bridge. At that point, the British regulars standing on the front of that bridge leveled their muskets right towards us and fired another volley without orders. Isaac Davis was the first to die at the North Bridge of Concord, thus fulfilling his wife's premonition that something bad was going to happen. As they were standing there, as Isaac Davis was bleeding out, there's another militiaman standing next to him. He looked up and he looked up to Major Buttrick and he said, "My God, they're firing ball!" Meaning, ball, out of a real ball. Now the colonists were used to having the British fire at them. They just put a little powder in there and kind of shoot at them to get them off the streets. But this time it was real. For the first time in history, for the very first time in history, we were ordered to fire on the British Army. The British regulars, one of the most powerful armies in the world. Certainly the biggest army in the United States at that time, and very powerful. We were ordered to fire on them. Major Buttrick looked up. He looked at the regulars. He said, "Fire! For God's sakes, fire! Fire as fast as you can!" And everybody within earshot leveled their muskets and fired on towards that bridge. Right on that bridge. In 2 minutes, it was all over. The opening battle, one of the opening battles, the most famous battle in history on that day, was over. The smoke cleared. William Emerson, who was Reverend William Emerson's grandson, he wrote a poem about that called the Concord Hymn. And part of that hymn is on that statue below Isaac Davis on the North Bridge. He said that the April breeze with their flags unfurled, the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. When all was said and done, when you look at the casualties at the North Bridge of Concord, on the British side, about 45% of them were all officers. We knew how to shoot, and we knew who to shoot. It was the officers. And those young British regulars didn't know what to do after that. This was their first time they'd been out in a real battle since they were conscripted over from England. They turned tail and they started running. Meanwhile, down in Concord, Colonel Smith, he heard those shots. He knew something was wrong. He was an experienced British soldier. He heard that. He got on his horse. He didn't have to go more than 50 or 60 yards. He saw one of the most frightening things in his whole life. And that was his army in full retreat. Our effective marksmanship had caused the British regulars to retreat. And they were a militia. Common everyday folks, just like you and me, right here today. We had no army back then. It was just our militia. They got all the regulars, got back, they assembled in Concord. Major John Pickerin, who didn't get the cannon, who didn't get any arms, he didn't get any munitions, he got nothing. But he knew he had violated orders, his men had violated orders. He was very upset. He went into a bar, he ordered a drink. His finger was bloody from a previous scuffle. He stuck his bloody finger in his drink. He sucked it down, threw the glass out on the floor, and he was getting ready to walk out the door. He's walking out the door of that tavern. There's 2 or 3 people in there, old people, a couple old men, an old woman, a few kids, all kind of huddled in there, looking up. Pickerin went over there. He looked him in the eye, and he said, "I was hoping to spill some damn Yankee blood before the end of the day, and he walked out. Major Pitcairn walked out of the Royal Marines. He just had his rear end pretty much handed to him. It was just a few weeks before that he'd ride through the colonies and pull a sword out. He said, I could pull my sword out and all of Boston would run. Today, he was proven wrong. Well, the colonists didn't know what to do. They thought, okay, we've just caused them a retreat. It must be over now. So they kind of just, a lot of them went home. The British regulars had 21 miles to retreat back to Boston. They had to retreat back to Boston. They weren't going to be fighting their way back. They'd been out for 24 hours. As they started leaving the town of Boston, they came up on a little place called Miriam's Corner, where the formation had to get into another tight circle again. This time, somebody else fired a shot. We don't know if it was our side or the British side. But when the British fired, everybody within earshot, everybody within close range of where that shot fired out started shooting. This time, our side, our men didn't wait for orders to shoot. Everybody shot. This time it was self-defense. Everybody was shooting at the threat that the British were. This is often what we call where our country actually was birthed at this point. It's a point we say that we didn't wait around for someone to tell us what to do. We did the right thing. We went from being British Americans to Americans. Many historians and philosophers will say that that was the day, that was the place that this country technically was birthed. They still had to get back to Boston. They were a long ways from Boston. As they started marching, they got to a place called Menotomy, which is called Arlington Day. It was the scene of the bloodiest fighting of the Revolutionary War. It's estimated over 4,000 people had showed up to fight. It was door to door, hand-to-hand contact. It was bloody and brutal. One man, a very famous man named Jason Russell, who was part of the militia, was boarding up his house. He called in about 15 or 20 of the militia, and they barricaded the house. And they were getting ready to fight the British because they knew they were going to be coming back. One of the other militia leaders raced down the road to say, Mr. Russell, you got to get out of here. He got his wife and the kids out, but he looked at this other guy and he said, an Englishman's home is his castle. How many of you have heard of castle doctrine? You heard of castle doctrine? It has to do with Second Amendment rights and your ability to defend yourself when somebody comes in your house. Well, somebody came in their house that day. The British regulars stormed that house. In about 15 minutes, there was nobody alive in Jason Russell's home. His wife, who had been safely sent away, came back with her kids. She wrote in her diary what she saw when she first opened that door up. She said, there were bodies piled everywhere and the blood was ankle deep. Nobody came out of that house alive. These men fought for our liberty so that we could be free men today. These are individuals, all of them, who stood up. They still have, the British regulars still have to get to Boston. They have to get to Boston and they have to get fast. They still have no food. The fighting was so brutal, they were so dehydrated. It was said that they were drinking out of puddles that had blood in them. They were that parched and that thirsty. As they marched down to the towards the river, it looked like the high April waters would trap the British Army right there. The British commanders had to make a very tough choice, so they decided they couldn't cross the river because the colonists had pulled all the planks out of the bridge, so they couldn't retreat. So they thought they were going to trap them. But what they did, the British regulars marched their men straight up towards Boston. They finally reached the place. The British regulars finally reached the place and they collapsed. They collapsed on a place called Bunker Hill. You've probably heard of that. That's actually where the British Army collapsed at the end of the first day of the Revolutionary War. So not only was the sun setting on Boston Harbor, the sun was setting on the ruins of the British Empire in America, and we're on our way to a 7.5-year bloody war that we would win. And we would go on to write our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, and get our Second Amendment that would create all the liberties that we enjoy today, including this center. Adventure Camp. All of our liberties exist by virtue of the fact that this country was founded on the principles of effective marksmanship. Never ever forget that. Never ever surrender your firearms. When you look at the casualty rates at the end of the day, for every one of us that was killed, missing, or wounded, 3 of the British regulars were killed, missing, or wounded. That's how effective we were. That's how committed to liberty we were at that time. Words like live free and die, or give me liberty, or give me death, those were words they lived by. That was a code they lived by. It's not just like bumper stickers you see on cars today. That was a code they lived by that defined the American Revolution. You guys stand at that flagpole every morning, and when you hear the national anthem, for the rest of your life, think about the sacrifices that were made so that we could be free men and women. It all started on April 19th, 1775. That's where our country was born. This is the best place in the world to learn about leadership, patriotism, and marksmanship. We have sponsors that sponsor this camp, that care about our posterity. Posterity is like generations that live on. John Adams said, he has a famous posterity quote. He said, "Posterity, if you ever forget the sacrifices that my countrymen went through to secure your liberties, I will repent in heaven I made the effort." Do you think today that John Adams would be repenting? Say it. Do you think he's repenting? Some people say no. You think he's repenting? How does that make you feel? Yeah, it's something to think about. Think about that. Let that sink in. Think about how you want to be committed to liberty. What are you going to do to take this country by the reins and run it? You guys are going to be running this country. The founders gave you the keys, everything you need to be active. We have the cartridge box. We have the ballot box, the jury box, and the soap box. You want to use the last 3 boxes before we ever have to use the cartridge box. The cartridge box is not the box you want to use. The founders knew what they wanted. They never ever wanted us to have to go through what they just went through. That's why we have one of the freest countries in the world. That's why we have our system of checks and balances, this government. That's all I have to say. Love you all. God bless. God bless America. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your stay at camp. That's all I have to say. I think you guys are ready to go back inside and get the next group out here. Thank you all.
What do we say, Dan? Thank you. Let's try that again. What do we say to Dan?
Thank you!
And Eric. And
That's too late.
Work the kinks out of your legs, go inside.
oh my gosh.
Where are you?